And exactly 2 months from today, Donald Trump will be sworn in as president again. One of the first policy issues that the new Congress will face is taxes, which is the topic for today's hearing. Tax policy in 2025, implications for the U.S. economy and American workers. Donald Trump and congressional Republicans have made perfectly clear that they are planning another huge tax giveaway to billionaires and billionaire corporations. Donald Trump said it out loud on the campaign trail. Big tax cuts will be a payoff for his rich as hell donors. Now, this isn't our first time around on tax giveaways to the wealthy. In 2017, Donald Trump had only one major legislative achievement, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This $2 trillion tax scam gave away trillions in tax cuts to billionaires and billionaire corporations. The law literally gave away money that otherwise would have come in to keep our country running. The impact was huge. That Trump tax cut for billionaires and billionaire corporations alone would have been big enough to build 3 million new homes and lower rents by 10% nationwide, to cut child care costs for most families to $10 a day, and to invest in paid leave for all American workers, all of those. Instead, the money went to billionaires and billionaire corporations. In fact, the Trump tax cut for billionaires was so gigantic that Republicans used a bunch of accounting gimmicks to try to hide the full cost. But those gimmicks and some of those tax cuts as a result will expire at the end of 2025. And this is the reason that Republicans are pushing for a new tax law. Without a change in the tax laws, many of those Trump giveaways to billionaires and billionaire corporations will simply disappear. So Trump and his allies are riding to the rescue. According to an estimate from the Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation, Republican plans to extend their tax giveaways to the rich will cost a whopping $4.5 trillion. And that is before Trump added in a few trillion more in extra goodies. $4.5 trillion and counting. The number is huge, but because tax cuts for rich people are actually unpopular in this country, Republicans are hoping to do this very quietly so that no one except their billionaire friends will notice what's going on. This will be a challenge. The last time that Trump and the congressional Republicans cut taxes, Americans did notice. They noticed, and they hated Trump's billionaire tax cuts. His billionaire tax cuts were more unpopular than any tax reform bill since Ronald Reagan. Trump's billionaire tax cuts were even more unpopular than the tax increases under Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. When Trump's billionaire tax cuts passed, his approval rating dropped like a rock. The reason Trump's billionaire tax cuts is so unpopular is that voters want billionaires and big businesses to pay their fair share toward making our country run. Republicans thought they could cover up their giveaways to billionaires and billionaire corporations by adding a few dollars in tax cuts to working families. But that is the wrong approach. Tax cuts for working families are a good idea, but tax cuts for working people are not tied to tax cuts for billionaires. We can have one without the other. And we should say it loud and clear. Billionaires don't need handouts from the federal government, period. Which brings us back to the tax fight barreling toward us. President-elect Trump has proposed making every single 2017 tax cut for the wealthy permanent. In fact, he plans to go further by cutting the corporate tax rate even more so that giant corporations making record profits off struggling Americans can shovel even more cash to their rich executives and shareholders. Make no mistake, hardworking Americans will foot the bill for tax cuts for Trump's wealthy donors. A recent analysis of President-elect Trump's tax proposals by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy found that the top 1% would get an average tax cut of over $36,000, while the bottom 95% of taxpayers would see a tax increase. Both Project 2025 and Trump himself have laid out Republican plans to pay for their next tax giveaway to billionaires. They are planning for higher taxes on everyday items that families buy, like groceries and gas and clothing and so on. They also plan to pay for the tax cuts for billionaires by cutting programs like Social Security and Head Start. They also plan to cut investments that grow our economy and support good jobs, like roads and bridges and medical research. Those aren't tax changes that will help working families. Americans across the country, of course, are from every political party, and they are demanding a tax code that works for them. People want Congress to raise taxes on giant corporations that are raking in record profits. People want Congress to close the loopholes that let billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk pay zero in taxes. And people want Congress to fully fund the IRS so that it has the resources to catch wealthy tax cheats and make them pay what they owe. The tax fight is starting now, and every person in the United States needs to show, every person in the Senate needs to show the American people what side we stand on. Will we sign our names to more giveaways to President-elect Trump's billionaire buddies, or will we fight for tax fairness for the American people? So I appreciate our panelists joining us today to share their expertise. The upcoming tax decisions are critically important to the financial security of working people, and we appreciate your being here with us to highlight the impact of those decisions. So I'm going to introduce the witnesses we have today, and then we'll go to our witness statements. We're good on that? Okay. So we've got three great witnesses with us today to share their views on the impact of tax reform on our economy and on working Americans, and I appreciate your being here today. First, we have Liz Shuler, who is the president of the AFL-CIO. Ms. Shuler is a visionary leader and a fierce advocate for the labor movement. She has dedicated her career to improving the livelihoods of working people across this country. Second, we have Mark Morial, who is president and CEO of the National Urban League. Mr. Morial is one of the nation's leading voices and advocates on redefining civil rights for the 21st century. He works tirelessly to close the economic gaps facing Americans of color. And lastly, we have Mr. Brendan Duke, who is an expert in tax and economic policy at the Center for American Progress. He also served as a senior policy advisor at the White House National Economic Council and as staff director for the U.S. Senate Finance Subcommittee on Taxation and IRS Oversight. Thank you all for being here with us today, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. Ms. Shuler, you are now recognized.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chairperson Warren, Ranking Member Kennedy, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Liz Shuler, president of the AFL-CIO, here on behalf of the nearly 13 million workers in our 60 different unions that represent essentially every sector of the economy and working class people writ large, frankly. And, you know, we're thinking about what's coming up next week. Next Thursday, American workers and their families are going to sit down at the Thanksgiving table. And many of them will be among the 60% of Americans who live paycheck to paycheck. The 63% who say they cannot afford to buy a home. The 100 million that are saddled with medical debt. They'll give thanks for what they do have, their families, their loved ones, the chance for at least one day to take a break from the 12-hour shifts, the long days, and enjoy a meal together. There's one group, actually, though, who should be really giving thanks next Thursday, and that is the 800 billionaires in this country who are about to receive yet another gift that they do not need. If you're a billionaire in America, you have a lot to be thankful for. You've enjoyed a system that has worked in your favor for a long time now. You've had years where you pay zero in federal taxes, literally not 1 cent, while the workers at your companies actually pay their fair share. And now you have an incoming administration that wants to hand you more money and power at the expense of the rest of us. We're often told the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, giving trillions in tax breaks to the wealthiest people and companies in the history of the world, while their fellow Americans struggle to pay for rent and groceries, I believe is the very definition of insanity. The rest of us will pay for this, just like we did in 2017. We were told that those corporate tax cuts would trickle down in the form of $4,000 raises for each worker. Well, let me tell you, they didn't. The Tax Policy Center told us the wealthiest top 5% of earners got triple the effective tax cut that the bottom 60% received. Those tax cuts did not make life more affordable. In fact, corporations have been gouging working families, with one Economic Policy Institute study finding more than 40% of higher prices were attributable to corporate greed. We were told not to worry, though, that those same tax cuts for the wealthy exploded the deficit by $2 trillion. Don't worry about that. And now Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to come in now 7 years later and tell us that they need to slash government spending, our healthcare, our Social Security, food assistance for seniors and families in need by that same exact amount, $2 trillion, the hole that Trump created in the first place. Again, insanity. This 2025 bill will come at us fast and furious, because that's how it works in this country when billionaires want something done. Working people, they've been waiting for 17 years for Congress to pass a minimum wage increase. It's been 50 years since Congress last enacted any sort of labor law reform, and we know that having a union creates equity, it lifts all workers' pay and benefits, and it narrows the racial wealth gap and the gender pay gap. So while working people are often forced to back off of they're at the back of the legislative line, the last Trump tax bill for the rich was actually completed before the first Christmas that he was in office. The incoming administration will tell us that they have a mandate. The mandate that I see from this election is that working people, they are fed up with the status quo and a system that has been rigged against them for too long. If we see a repeat of 2017, it's going to be nothing more than the same status quo that working Americans have just stood up against. There's a real opportunity to do something different, and I think that's what we're here to talk about today. If Congress has the courage, here's what working people would suggest. We have a long list in my written testimony, but a few. Let the top marginal tax rate for the country's richest people reset to the pre-2017 level. Second, reestablish the estate tax so that we are not passing down an oligarchy to the next generation. Number 3, close the loophole on carried interest. Number 4, enact a minimum tax on the ultra-wealthy, a common sense policy that a vast majority of this country across all political ideologies actually agrees with. And 5, maintain any provisions that directly benefit working people, including continuing and expanding the child tax credit. Make things more fair. Give people a reason to believe in this system, and my written testimony contains a long list, as I said, of other proposals that would benefit working families. To conclude, the rich, the large profitable corporations, and Wall Street have all benefited from the vast opportunities this country affords them. It is time for them to pay their fair share, and just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here today with you.
Thank you very much. Very powerful testimony. Mr. Morial.
Thank you very much. Chair Warren, Senator Smith, in his absence, to Ranking Member Kennedy, who, like me, is from the great state of Louisiana. I'm proud today, on behalf of the National Urban League, to offer these comments, which summarize my written testimony. Number 1, in 2017, we were promised that the 2017 tax cut bill would be deficit neutral and would provide jobs for the people of this nation. What we know today is that the wealthiest Americans got whole loaves of bread, multigrain, white, baguettes, French, lobster rolls, and you name it, and working men and women got crumbs. We were promised that dynamic scoring, a 21st century version of the old Laffer curve, would ensure that economic growth would make up for the loss in revenues. We knew that the Laffer curve was a laugh and dynamic scoring is a mirage. What Americans were promised has not come to pass. And once again, it is rinse and repeat. We're about to see the same arguments, the same fantasy stories posited forward in support of an extension of the 2017 tax cuts. I'm here today to suggest to you that instead of a Wall Street caviar champagne tax cut plan, we need a Main Street dogs and pizza plan that the National Urban League calls the Main Street Tax Initiative. And here are a few features of it that we suggest. Number one, instead of all the talk about doing something for working people, how about trying something different, like cutting taxes in half for Americans that make under $100,000? Fully 60% of all Americans make less than $100,000. By cutting their taxes in half, we would truly put money in their pockets for gas, for housing, for bread, for milk, for those expensive co-pays in medicine. Number two, let's restore the child tax credit, which pulled people, children, out of poverty at a record level. Let's expand, make permanent, and simplify the earned income tax credit. Those three provisions alone would do more for working men and women beyond the rhetoric, beyond the talk, beyond the conversation. Then let's address, to the extent that we can, Senator Warren, something that I know you are passionate about, and that is this housing crisis in America. Let's expand the low-income housing tax credit, and let's create a new affordable housing tax credit which puts money into affordable home ownership for American people. Let's address the problems that we see. And then I'd also like to highlight what I call the fair deal. The fair deal is to say to those people in America with assets above $1 billion, I think 770 people, you need to pay a modest surtax on your assets in an effort to be fair. It is not fair for the police officer, the firefighter, the teacher, the nurse, your staff, cafeteria workers, public sector workers. It's not fair for them to pay a higher tax rate than America's billionaires. This can be addressed with a modest surtax, which would address and be paid for by fewer people that are working in this building at this moment, 770 Americans. In summation, it's now time to do something for the working men and women of America. It's also time to end the fantasy and the facade that somehow cutting taxes for the wealthiest Americans somehow will create jobs and economic growth for the rest of us. The evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is clear. Those strategies do not work, and they have not worked. And in offering these provisions, we suggest another way to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morial. Really appreciate your testimony here. Mr. Duke.
Thank you, Chair Warren, Ranking Member Kennedy, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Brendan Duke, and I am Senior Director for Economic Policy at the Center for American Progress. I'm honored to testify today on the 2017 tax law and the implications of extending its expiring provisions next year. My main message to you is this: letting the tax cuts expire is a far, far better alternative than saying yes to a bill that will entrench income inequality and rip off working and middle-class Americans down the road. But first, let's remember how we got here. Congressional Republicans and Donald Trump deeply wanted a cut in the corporate tax rate. They also knew that cutting taxes just for corporations without cutting taxes for individuals would have been a political disaster. So they pursued a party line tax cut and limited themselves to a cost of $1.5 trillion over 10 years. And because they did this using the budget reconciliation process, they could not increase deficits beyond the 10-year window. And this gave birth to the bill that actually passed. They made a big, permanent 40% cut to the corporate tax rate and paid for it beyond the 10-year window by raising taxes on families across the board and by cutting health care. Then they did a series of tax cuts for individuals, again, heavily tilted to the wealthy. But because they couldn't even limit the size of those tax cuts to $1.5 trillion, they set them to expire in 2025. And here we are today at the beginning of the debate about what to do about them. What have we learned? The corporate rate cut, the centerpiece of the original bill, was a massive windfall for investors, spurring a $1 trillion surge in stock buybacks. Yet it failed to meaningfully increase business investment, and none of that windfall trickled down to ordinary workers. And the recovery in housing investment after the Great Recession, which was powering along, screeched to a halt after the bill passed. CBO, in fact, projected that, quote, residential investment is reduced throughout the entire period by crowding out, end quote. Given that the corporate tax cut didn't trickle down, we should then focus on the direct tax cuts it gave to families, which are the ones that expire next year. Any way you look at it, extending these expiring provisions will increase income inequality, cutting taxes for rich people while giving pennies to everyone else. The average tax cut for the top 1% of Americans is more than 60 times larger than that of the middle 20% of Americans. It is more than 600 times larger than that of the bottom 20% of Americans, who only got an average tax cut of $100 apiece. And even these numbers are too rosy. We are talking about a tax cut that will add $4 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. These tax cut numbers include money we are borrowing that we will have to pay back one day in the form of tax increases or spending cuts. One financing mechanism Trump has floated is a giant across-the-board tax on all imported goods. A range of analyses, from progressive to conservative think tanks, estimate that this would cost a typical family thousands of dollars by making a trip to the grocery store or pharmacy more expensive. Just yesterday, Walmart told investors that they would raise prices in reaction to these taxes on imported goods. It's important to note that the size, magnitude, nature, and purpose of these taxes differ greatly from the strategic tariffs the presidents of both parties have employed over the years. Alternatively, they can pursue cuts to vital programs Americans rely on. Tesla CEO Elon Musk, a co-head of the new Department of Governmental Efficiency, has proposed $2 trillion in annual spending cuts. Taken literally, this would cut every program in the budget on average by roughly 1/3, including Medicare, Social Security, food safety inspection, cancer and stroke research, and nutrition for newborns. Finally, the Trump administration and some congressional Republicans could find that the easiest way to offset the cost of the tax cuts is to not offset them at all. That's what they did last time. But there's no free lunch here. The tax cuts will likely be paid for eventually in the form of spending cuts or tax increases down the line. The very real danger of cuts to programs that low and middle income families rely on, including Social Security and Medicare eventually, highlights why Congress must offset the tax cuts they extend in a revenue neutral manner. This also means rejecting attempts to pretend that extending the expiring provisions have no cost, otherwise known as a current policy baseline. This type of baseline undermines good budgetary practice and is logically inconsistent. Under that type of analysis, the failure to renew the 2021 American Rescue Plan rebate checks in 2022 amounted to a $5,600 tax increase for a family of four that nobody complained about. Simply changing the accounting convention does not remove the burden of extending these tax cuts will place on federal and eventually on families' finances. The good news is that there are ways to smartly and efficiently raise revenue from high-income households and corporations, such as raising the corporate tax rate to 28%. These are far better ways to find savings than making a trip to the grocery store more expensive through taxes on imported goods or cutting vital programs like Medicaid. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duke. Really powerful data there. Appreciate it. Senator Van Hollen, would you like to start the questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for holding this hearing. Thank all of you for testifying. Thank my colleagues for letting me have some questioning now because I have to go to something immediately. And I think it's important that when you have a train coming at the American people and the working people throughout this country, we should get a preview of what to expect if we don't ourselves take action to stop it. And we've got, as you've all testified, clear evidence of what's coming at us because it came at us once before. So I do think it's important to lay the sort of foundation of the claims that were made before and whether or not they ever came true, whether they ever materialized. So I do want to start with the claim that the 2017 Trump tax giveaway to the rich, which included a major cut in the corporate tax from 35% to 25%, whether or not that paid for itself. And Mr. Morial, I know you were prescient here. I know during the debate over the 2017 tax cuts, you wrote a piece entitled, quote, "Trump's tax cuts are a feast for the wealthy and gruel for working families," unquote. And in it, you said that supporters of the bill, quote, "like to say their huge tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations will pay for themselves through greater economic growth. Even conservative economists know it's a lie," unquote. Mr. Morial, just for the record again, now we're here many years later, did those tax cuts ever pay for themselves?
No, no, and no.
So it was a lie then, and it's a lie now.
It was a lie, and it was economic fantasy theory. George W. Bush called it voodoo economics. I call it hocus pocus dominocus.
That sounds right to me. We were also told at the time that the tax cuts would generate a new wave of investments, that corporations would spend their tax savings in growing their businesses. So, Mr. Duke, did corporations suddenly start to make new investments to grow their businesses in the 2 years following the tax cut when corporations first felt the effects of those cuts and before COVID may have distorted the data?
Yeah, sure. The 2 years after, so ending in 2019, investment actually fell slightly. Economic growth was basically flat. The only thing powering it was government spending under a Republican Congress.
Right. And if I have my facts right, what corporations did do was took $108.6 billion in stock buybacks in 2018 to essentially pad their own executives' pockets and that of many of their top investors. So we were promised also that the corporations were going to use some of those tax savings, right, to increase the wages that they paid to their employees. In fact, Kevin Hassett, who was the head of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors at the time, said there would be, quote, "an immediate jump in wage growth," unquote, and then President Trump predicted an average wage increase of $4,000 per worker. So, Ms. Schuler, you represent a lot of working people in this country. Did the average American get a $4,000 raise from these tax cuts?
Senator, they did not. As Mark said, it was a mirage. And in fact, we had one of our unions go to their company in anticipation of this to try to bargain language in their contract to say, okay, if you're getting this windfall, then we're going to get our $4,000. Let's put it in writing. And of course, no company would agree to it, and it didn't happen.
Right. So as I watched this unfold, I did see some people get these big pay hikes. They just happened to be the top executives who received an average pay increase of $50,000 on average. I'm assuming none of your members, Ms. Schuler, saw anything like that, right?
They did not. And you may also be aware that we track CEO to worker pay ratios on our website. We do an annual pay watch. And the CEO to worker pay ratio actually is now at 268 to 1. And I think this is one of the reasons why.
And when these corporations were making all these additional profits because they got these big tax cuts, you've said that they didn't pass on the savings to their workers. They didn't make additional business investments that helped grow the economy. Did they at least, since they were making these profits, lower prices to consumers? Did we see any of that?
We continue to see the opposite, which is price gouging and, of course, taking advantage of, things like the pandemic, where the supply and demand was, demand was outpacing supply, and they jacked up prices and, of course, never lowered them when we were coming out of the recession.
And I would add this. The proponents need to be held to account for the promises they made. They made a long series of promises. the evidence is unambiguous that few of these promises, if any of them, were ever kept. And so why would we lather, rinse, and repeat on policies that did not yield what the proponents suggested they should yield? And I think that should be the framework around the discussion, is did it work? Did it work?
Thank you, Mr. Morial, and that's why I want to thank Senator Warren for reminding us of the claims and what actually happened as a preview of what they might try to do again and claim again. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Smith.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Warren, and thanks for your generosity in letting me go next in this questioning. And thanks so much to our panelists for this really important discussion. So President Trump often touts his 2017 tax bill as historic, delivering the biggest tax cuts in American history. Sounds good, right? I mean, that's what people want. They want tax cuts, apparently. But the question is who gains and who pays when this goes around and comes around. And this conversation is establishing that Trump tax cuts did provide historic tax cuts, but for massive corporations. I really appreciate the line of questioning of Senator Van Hollen as he's going after this promise that this would trickle down to wages, President Schuler, to average working people. And as Senator Van Hollen has laid out, there was actually zero, as I understand it, zero increase in wages that could be attributed to the Trump tax cuts. But is there any benefit that you could see that working Americans experience because of these big corporate tax cuts?
It's the opposite, because as we've seen inequality grow where workers are struggling,
Right.
and I know, I'm out talking to workers every week. I'm on the road. People are struggling with the basic necessities. They're working more than one job to make ends meet while they see those at the top making more. The companies that they help create the wealth for actually profiting, but none of those profits coming back in terms of wage increases. And every collective bargaining agreement we go to the table, we are fighting for scraps. And we've seen it time after time, workers going on strike because they have been pent up, right? They've been doing more with less and not seeing the returns. And so I think, it's the same old story where none of this trickled down. It was all a fantasy, and we don't want to fall for it again.
That's right. And Mr. Morial, I mean, I know you've done such important work on addressing the wage and wealth disparity that we see in this country. Is there any evidence that this Trump tax cut to big corporations had any positive impact on reducing that wage disparity or wealth disparity?
Thank you for the question. I think it's exacerbated it.
Right.
Because it's lifted up, and we have a greater gulf between quote-unquote haves and have-nots and have-mores in this country. We have a widening gap when it comes to wealth between black and white Americans and Latinos. That is the evidence. That is what is clear. None of these commitments and promises have come to be true, and that is so important. And closing that gap, closing the widening gap, should be the aim of any serious economic policy in this country. And so that's why I think many of us have offered alternatives.
That's right.
A different way of going.
And Mr. Duke, I think we've been discussing how so much of those big corporate tax cuts went into stock buybacks. So is there any evidence that those big stock buybacks benefited regular Americans in any way?
Not unless they own billions of dollars of stock. We saw a $1 trillion surge in stock buybacks. We saw that they took basically 2 dimes out of every dollar and put it into investment at all into the whole thing. So again, it just didn't trickle down. The primary beneficiaries, when you look at the wage gains, were shareholders, executives, and the top 10% of workers, the bottom 90% of workers.
Right.
Best study, 0, 0, 0, 0.
Right. So you got tax cuts, and you ask the question, who gains and who pays? And we see the time after time after time with the Trump tax cuts that the folks that gained were those at the very, very top, and the folks that pay are the folks that always pay. So I would argue Chair Warren, that when Americans went to the ballot boxes and voted this election, they weren't voting for more tax cuts for billionaires. They were voting because their lives cost too much. They were voting because they wanted to afford their lives. And one of the biggest places where that's a challenge is, of course, the issue of housing and how much it costs for housing. So let me just ask, I just have a couple minutes left, but I'm going to go to you, Mr. Duke. In the Trump tax cuts, there were some pretty generous tax benefits and tax subsidies for big investors who, in my home state, are going out there and buying up housing, which is ending up driving up rents and the cost of owning a new home for regular Minnesotans. Is that what you see with the impact of the Trump tax cuts on the cost of housing in this country?
Yeah, first of all, real estate developers got very big tax breaks, but we saw was housing investment cratered after. When you just look at the trend, we were recovering out of the Great Recession,
right?
And then it just cratered and hasn't come back since
then.
Like
the amount of housing that was being built to address the housing supply shortage got worse.
Exactly. You can just see it directly on the line. In some ways, I would say it's industrial policy away from housing. It's industrial policy to raise rents by reducing the supply of housing.
Yes, that's exactly right. And this, Chair Warren and colleagues, is one of the reasons why the legislation that I've introduced with Representative Ocasio-Cortez on getting after a market that is so dominated by these big ticket, big deep-pocketed investors that it is crowding out regular investors and crowding out the work that we need to do to address this housing supply shortage in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Smith. So I'm going to do a round of questions, and then we'll go to Senator Helmy, if that's all right, because I've got 2 rounds here that I want to get to. All right. So a progressive tax code can give a break to families and small businesses while making sure that those at the top pay a fair share. And that gives us enough money to make the investments we need to make in roads and bridges and infrastructure and schools and Social Security and the things we need to buy to keep this country going. I want to talk for just a minute, though, about the politics and power, about how all of this works. For decades now, instead of a tax system running that way, we've gotten caught in a doom loop on taxes. So Republicans pass these giant tax cuts for the wealthy. They toss a few small breaks to everyone else. And then, because of the special tax breaks they get, the rich get richer, and their growing piles of cash fund the armies of lobbyists that demand even greater tax breaks. Meanwhile, because billionaires and billionaire corporations are skipping out on their tax bills, deficits go through the roof. Republicans then use rising deficits as an excuse to cut the programs that American families rely on. Over time, the rich get richer and everyone else gets left behind. The result, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk pay a lower tax rate than firefighters and public school teachers. So let's look at the most recent tax scam. I know we've gone over this a little bit, but I want to see if we can get it on the record and then tie it into other parts of what's happening here. $2 trillion tax giveaway to millionaires and billionaires that Donald Trump signed in 2017. And the sequel he's now promised that he will renew for his billionaire buddies this year. So, Mr. Duke, what was the impact of the 2017 Trump tax cuts on the U.S. economy? Did those tax cuts trickle down and supercharge our economy?
No. Economic growth stayed the same. Investment fell. Stock buybacks, though, did surge.
Okay, so let's see. Business investment actually fell?
Slightly.
All right.
And housing investment cratered.
Housing investment cratered. Corporate profits, what happened to them?
They went up after tax.
Corporate profits went up. Stock buybacks? Record stock buybacks up, and executive pay.
That also went up.
Okay. Ms. Schuler, tell me, did the Trump tax cuts trickle down to the 12.5 million union workers that you represent at the AFL-CIO? Transportation workers, food workers, teachers, construction workers, nurses, and more?
The simple answer is no. The tax cuts, of course, went to CEOs, shareholders, not workers. And every dollar in tax cuts that a bigwig in the top 1% got, a worker at the bottom 60% got less than 1 cent.
So the rich get $1, and the workers get a penny.
Less
Right?
than a penny.
Less
Yep,
than a
yep,
penny.
Yep.
Okay, I think we're detecting a theme here. And Mr. Moreno, did the 2017 tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires lift up Black Americans and other underserved communities that you represent at the National Urban League?
Not at all. Not at all. The tax cuts widened the racial wealth gap, and there was no impact on incomes or on closing the twin of the racial wealth gap, which is the racial income gap. So there was no impact. There's no evidence that it had an impact. And any positive movement between then and now came from the American Rescue Plan, came from the post-COVID investments that were led by the Biden administration and many of you. That's important. So any improvement cannot be attributed to the 2017 tax cuts.
Okay, so this time around, though, it's going to be the same old scam. Trump has promised he will splash out another $4 trillion, extending all of his rich pals' tax cuts, and throw a few more goodies in for good measure, and that he will give another rate cut for billionaire corporations. And he's promised a little something extra for big oil, and that means one more loophole for Wall Street. Here's the part now that I want to see if we can draw a connection. Special interests lavished eye-popping amounts of money to get Donald Trump reelected. And now these same special interests are ready to collect. But wait, Donald Trump says, don't mind all that. He says that he will cut taxes on overtime pay and Social Security for everyone else. So that's how this is going to work out. Ms. Schuler, you represent these workers. Is that a good deal for workers?
No, and the operative word is scam. It's the exact same scam that we've seen before. And so the Trump plan is to give your average worker pennies, or less than a penny, as we've said, while the real money and the benefits of the plan actually go to the rich, and so thus widening this gap that we've all been talking about. And not taxing overtime sounds good, but we all heard Trump's Project 2025 would actually eliminate overtime. So we keep saying, okay, well, I guess you can make a promise to not tax something that doesn't exist. That's a pretty easy, taxing zero is zero. But we've also seen that, a Trump-appointed judge actually just blocked the Biden administration's rule to provide overtime pay protections for 4 million workers, as we saw in the Biden administration, that expansion. And so that Trump-appointed judge blocked it. So I think this is just another, as we've said, another attempt to pay for a tax giveaway to the people who don't need it. People like Elon Musk, who propose to slash federal programs, whether it's Social Security to affordable child care, to investments in good manufacturing jobs, like we've seen with clean energy investments that we know have been coming. If you eliminate those, that's actually going to create a downward pressure on the ability to have a pathway to the middle class and have good jobs in this country, to pay for these tax cuts that we do not need.
That's right. So think about that. Donald Trump says he will slash taxes, end taxes on overtime, but he will also end overtime, and says he will cut taxes on Social Security at the same time that his running buddy right now, Elon Musk, is saying they're going to slash Social Security. Trump and his buddies think that if they throw small cuts to working people, that no one will notice that millionaires and billionaires are pocketing trillions of dollars. They think that if they give small tax cuts to working people, that they won't notice when infrastructure jobs dry up or when their Social Security checks are cut. But the American people are not so easily fooled. In December 2017, when Donald Trump signed his $2 trillion tax giveaway into law, it was his lowest approval rating of his entire presidency second only to the insurrection that he stoked on January 6th. The American people know a scam when they see one. Trump's last tax giveaway was a scam of giant proportions, and his plans for another tax cut for billionaires is just more of the same. Thank you. Senator Helmy.
Thank you, Chairwoman. It's great to see some of you, especially those who have done so much for my home state, and thank you for being here. I think it's been amply demonstrated by my colleagues and the Chairwoman that the Trump tax cuts disproportionately benefited wealthy and large corporations, and that these benefits have had no positive impact on the economy and no material impact on working families. And to add a data point, Mr. Duke, I think you were mentioning this, is since the tax cuts, America's billionaires are now collectively worth a record $6 trillion, a wealth that has more than doubled since the Trump tax cuts. And researchers from both the Fed and the Joint Commission have concluded that 0% of those gains, have gone to the bottom 90% of workers. And unfortunately, it seems that some are not here to participate in this conversation, but rather than accept the data, it seems that we're on a pathway to continue that or even further it. And I would ask you, Mr. Duke, you've touched on some of this, but not only just the Trump tax cuts, but in other prior moments of policymaking in history, is there something that our colleagues can point to where these kinds of drastic tax cuts to corporations and to the wealthiest among us actually have some trickle-down effect on America's working families and firefighters and teachers and the middle class in New Jersey and through the nation?
I think all they can point to is that, oh, we need more tax cuts because this first round didn't work, so we just need more of the same, is kind of the argument that we've been hearing for the last few decades. There's no evidence that it has had any appreciable contribution to American, to the outsized GDP growth that the U.S. has had compared to its competitors.
And while I appreciate that some who are not here may disagree, I think policy positions are an explanation of priorities, and either you are prioritizing the consolidation of opportunity or you are looking to expand this country's economic wealth and growth from the middle class out. Ms. Schuler, you've been involved in so many things that we've been able to do in terms of the progressive agenda in New Jersey over the last 8 years. With this chairwoman's leadership in the Biden administration, the ARP was able to expand the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. Expanding these credits lifted approximately 10 million Americans out of poverty. The success was replicated in many of the states that we represent, specifically with your help. We were able to do it in New Jersey, providing a state-level credit that provided $1,000 to the lowest income families. Again, thinking about the priorities of whether we're prioritizing those who are already doubled their wealth in the last 7 years or the working class, in terms of just the workers you represent, labor or otherwise, what kind of an impact would expanding the CTC and the EITC mean?
So the traveling that I do and talking to workers, the most often raised issues are childcare and housing. And those are the costs that people are struggling with. And I'll just share one quick story. I went to a convening of 5,000 women in the trades, women who are accessing pathways to the middle class through good construction job training and making their way into good, stable employment because of these opportunities. And the one thing that kept coming up over and over again that is a barrier to getting more women into construction is childcare. And, they have unique, they deal with unique situations because they go to work early in the morning and often childcare is not available, or they're not able to, on a moment's notice, find the capacity that they need. So this would enable them to have some breathing room and to be able to plan for their lives and to make the investments in their future that puts them on this pathway to a better life.
Yeah, so on one hand, we're looking at a tax policy proposal that, again, continues to consolidate opportunity among the wealthiest and the largest corporations, while at the same time making it harder for those folks who want to get back into work and restart their careers after starting families. That seems to be a way to shrink economies, not expand them. Mr. Morial, I think I heard some of this on my way in on your testimony, and I would applaud the chairwoman's leadership on this issue. But housing affordability is a crisis, whether it be in northeastern states, in New Jersey, where I represent, or across the country. Home prices are 47% higher than they were just a few years ago. Much more acute for renters. We're 26% higher than just in 2020. In New Jersey, where we've had a progressive elevation in our minimum wage, which is now at $15 an hour, you would need to work 2 full-time jobs just to afford a 1-bedroom rental. Mr. Morial, can you give us, in the short time I have left, what ways we can use the tax code to address and make significant positive change in our housing crisis.
I did also want to just go on the record that working people would benefit greatly if we had a national living wage bill. It's long overdue, and states like New Jersey and many other states have done it on their own. But Senator Warren, we need a national living wage bill indexed to inflation. Now, in our proposal, the tax code could expand the low-income housing tax credit, which has been a tool used to expand affordable housing in this country. But I propose something else, and that is an affordable housing tax credit, which would be a tax credit that would put money into the construction of affordable home ownership opportunities. We need to not only build rental housing, we need to build housing that people can buy and build wealth. That's how you create intergenerational wealth, through property ownership, through home ownership. So the tax code could be shaped, could be used to do that. The New Markets Tax Credit Program is another that has been used to construct mixed-use, affordable housing in this country. There are a number of things that indeed can be done. None of them address what we really need, which is a housing supply initiative to really build the number of units. We've gotten so far behind in the last 25 years, and that's why the challenge is so acute. But there's a lot that could be done in an upcoming tax bill if we centralize the needs of working families. And I think, Senator Warren, you're so right in really saying, let's call for the proposers of the 2017 bill to account for their promises so that the American people understand and know that what they were promised did not occur. And in doing that, stop this or shape a better approach.
Madam Chairman, I just have 20 seconds to just make a statement to piggyback off of what Mark said. Just to make one statement about the SALT deduction. You mentioned about black and brown home ownership. And what goes undersaid about the SALT deduction, which is essential, in my opinion, to encouraging home ownership and wealth building in black and brown home ownership in communities, because they pay an inflated share of the property tax comparable to white homeowners. So as this committee considered these important issues, I would hope that the SALT tax cap goes away.
I concur.
Thank you, sir. And I would just, I think, end where you ended, Mark, and applaud our chairwoman's leadership on making sure that our tax policy is reflective of what's in the best interest of working families. Thank you.
So thank you, Senator Helmy, and thank you for the comments on this. So the Trump tax scam playbook has more than one page. Page one is hiding the giveaways to the wealthy by trying to throw some small cuts, or at least allegedly throw some small cuts to working Americans. Then there's page two, using magic math to pretend that the tax cuts don't cost anything at all. The 2017 Trump tax cut was so big that Republicans had to use budget gimmicks and accounting tricks in order to hide the true cost. One of the main tools was to set up a bunch of the cuts to expire next year that limited the cost to just $2 trillion. So what's Trump's second-term agenda? Keep cutting taxes for billionaires and pretend they don't cost anything. Magic math formula number one, save money by defunding the IRS and letting wealthy tax cheats off the hook. Mr. Duke, help us double-check the math here. Does cutting the IRS enforcement budget actually save any money?
No. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that every dollar cut from IRS enforcement actually increases the deficit by $2.50. Other estimates go as high as $11. And just fundamentally, they are trying to pay for tax cuts for the rich with tax cuts for the rich. It breaks the laws of arithmetic.
Yeah. But that's not the only magic math. Senator Crapo, the incoming chief Republican tax writer in the Senate, has an even better scam. He's running around Capitol Hill saying that Congress shouldn't pay for a single cent of the $5 trillion in the Trump tax cut extensions because that's just extending current policy. And if you're extending current policy, it doesn't cost anything. It's free. Mr. Duke, another math question for you. Does $2 trillion in tax cuts in 2017 plus another $5 trillion in extensions in 2025 equals $0 in cost?
No. I didn't hear Senator Crapo say that extending the American Rescue Plan child tax credit was also free because it would have just been expending current policy either. This is just a way to hide the cost of enormous tax cuts for the wealthy while clearing the way for Elon Musk's cuts to healthcare and food for families.
Yeah. You know, none of this is new. For decades, Republicans have over and over passed massive giveaways to the wealthy, used fake math to try to hide the true cost, and then turned around and claimed to be shocked by the ballooning deficit. Then, in fake outrage, they demand that we cut the deficit by cutting funding for everything from Social Security to public schools. Trump and his MAGA buddies have made clear that they plan to run the same play again next year. They want to hide the true cost of tax cuts for billionaires and billionaire corporations and do it while claiming that they're helping working people. Mr. Morial, should working people buy this?
No, and Senator Warren, since tax cut fever in the GOP began in the 1980s, I encourage all Americans to go look at the widening gap between rich and poor Americans, between rich Americans and middle-class Americans that so many people in elected office profess to champion for, and to look at the widening wealth and income gap since tax cut fever began in the 1980s in the GOP. You can do a through line. In the Reagan years, the economy was about a $5 trillion economy. Today, it's almost a $25 trillion economy. Yet, wages for the bottom 70% of Americans have not kept pace with that growth. In fact, it's gone in reverse. It's time for this tax cut fever to get the proper dosage of medicine, to end this, if you will, call it a scam? Yes, I call it razoo and a head fake, right? Get Americans looking over here believing that they're going to get something and they get crumbs. Yeah. While over on the other side, massive subsidies are given to Americans who don't want nor need these subsidies. And then behind it, come back and challenge the programs, workforce, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, aid to education, aid to small businesses that we sorely need. So you have, I think, Senator Warren, accurately characterized the current situation, and I'm just proud and committed to working with you and others to get a fair deal for the American people. The American people need a fair deal, a better deal when it comes to tax and fiscal policy.
Yeah. Oh, I very much appreciate your comments on this. Look, Democrats in Congress should flat out reject Trump's tax scam 2.0 and the junk math that Republicans are using to try to sell this thing. The tax code is not about magic math. It is about choices. Are we a country that invests in roads and bridges, in housing, in healthcare, in our children, or a nation that cuts taxes for billionaires and billionaire corporations? American families are counting on us to have their backs, and that means fighting for a tax code that demands that the wealthy pay their fair share, just like everyone else. A tax code that invests in American workers, a tax code that helps us build a stronger economy in which everyone gets a chance to participate. In next year's tax debate, every person in the United States Senate will have the opportunity to show the American people whose side they are on. The side of billionaires clamoring for more handouts, or the side of hardworking Americans. Because next year is a chance to fight for a tax code that works for working people, a chance to fight against more giveaways to the wealthy and giant corporations, and to flat out reject any package that includes billionaire handouts. It is a chance next year to fight for a tax code that raises taxes on the wealthy to fund the investments that we all need. And I am proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with working people across this country in this fight. I want to say one more time how much I thank the witnesses for being here today, for the testimony that you provide, and for the work you do every day. For any senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions will be due 1 week from today, Wednesday, November 27th. And for our witnesses, you will have 45 days to respond to any questions. Thank you again, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.